Alan Massey is one of the most controversial, entertaining and intelligent writers living in Scotland today. As well as books of fact and fiction, he is a fluent and contentious journalist, writing for a large number of publications on an astonishing range of subjects. He is best known, however, as a polemicist, consistently arguing on the side of the Tories and the Union and against the Scottish political consensus. Alan Massey writes from a point of principle in a society that seems largely to have forgotten about ethics. It is perhaps too glib to say that his fiction infects his journalism and vice versa, but both seem to be imbued with a strong sense of civic duty, of the responsibility of the individual to society at large, and of the exposure of cant. This is most clearly evident in his historical novels, Augustus, Tiberius, Caesar and Antony, which chart the rise and fall of the Roman Empire with wit and authority, and which stand comparison with the work of Robert Graves and Marguerite Yourcenar. These were all men who used and abused power, and Massey skillfully uses his novels to assess their character and achievement. He takes a similar standpoint in others of his works, particularly A Question of Loyalties, The Sins of the Father, and Shadows of Empire. In this triumvirate of novels, he examines the role of individuals and their part in great moments of history. How do essentially good men get caught up in acts of evil is the question he seems to be asking. It makes for compelling fiction. Alan Massey was born in Singapore in 1938. He was educated at Glenalmond and Trinity College, Cambridge. His education, he once wrote, was old-fashioned in its thoroughness. In any event, he was academically precocious. His first book, Change and Decay in All Around I See, published in 1978, was a comic novel. He followed this with The Last Peacock, another comic novel. But there was a marked change of tack with his third novel, The Death of Men, which was set in Italy and centred on the kidnapping and murder of Aldo Moro. Echoing Graham Greene, Massey fashioned a compelling, sophisticated political thriller. After living in Edinburgh for a number of years, Alan Massey now lives in the Scottish borders. He is married with 3 children, and when not writing or puffing on a gitaine, likes to watch cricket and rugby. His favourite quotation comes from Lampedusa's novel The Leopard, in which Tancredo, a conservative with a small c, says, "Things will have to change if we want them to remain the way they are." Let's go back to the beginning, before you ever actually had a word published anywhere. Did you set out to be a certain kind of writer? Did you have a writer in mind who you wanted to be like?
No, I don't think so.
You had no ambition?
I had lots of ambition, but I don't think I had one writer that I wanted to be like. I mean, I suppose, like a lot of people in my generation, you were influenced by people in the generation before you rather than your own generation, obviously, and Waugh, Fitzgerald, even Hemingway, one way or another, were influences. Some of my early short stories were quite Hemingway-esque, and I remember Alan Ross at the London Magazine telling me I should find myself for any echo of Hemingway.
You should find yourself?
Find myself, yes.
A sixpence or
he didn't suggest
a
the sum.
whiskey.
He didn't suggest the sum.
But this is what every writer surely does. They start to ape someone. They play the sedulous ape, as Stevens has said, that before you actually find your own voice. And that surely takes some time, doesn't it?
It takes some time. I don't think every writer does it quite. I mean, Stevenson said he played the sedulous ape to Hazlitt, in that he actually deliberately imitated Hazlitt in his essays. I don't think I ever did that, and I doubt if many people actually do that. But certainly it takes time to find your own voice. And if I were to look back on unpublished work in my 20s, into my 30s, I think I would be horribly embarrassed.
But the writers you mentioned there just now, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Waugh, they have a certain glamour to them. They had a glamour even 3 or 4 decades ago to them. So writing has a glamour to you? Is it a kind of seductive performance?
I think it had. I think when everybody with serious intentions, when you start out writing, you think that this will change the world, or that somehow, or if it won't change the world, it will justify your own life. I'm not so sure that I feel that now.
I mean, what was the point of writing anyway? I mean, is it building another brick on this enormous edifice of English literature? Is that why people write? They write to be better, say, than Dickens or Lawrence or Hardy?
Well, there is the competitive thing. There again, Hemingway is the great example of it. Talking of getting in the ring with Mr. Tolstoy, there is that competitive thing. You want to do better, but I think the main thing about writing, or the main attraction of it, is the same as any other art. The pleasure to be taken from making something which is new and distinctive and your own. Now I'm not musical. I'm no good with my hands, and so writing is the art form I'm stuck with. But it's a sort of carpentry, really.
But did you think, though, that it would ever provide you with a living? I mean, do you think actually now, as you write, and you are undoubtedly probably one of the most prolific living writers around, not only books, obviously, but journalism as well, did you think that this was the kind of writer's life you were going to end up leading?
Well, when I started out, everybody said you can't possibly live off writing. So it's quite nice to prove that you can. I mean, lots of people do. I depend a lot on journalism as well, but then I don't make any particular distinction.
Do you not? I mean, writers, real writers, as novelists, poets, playwrights are called, are supposed not to get in bed with journalists. There's innumerable warnings saying, stay away from these sullied halls. Cyril Connolly warned about the dangers of writing journalism and getting dependent on it. V.S. Pritchett said, don't get dependent on reviewing. But you're dependent on both.
Yes, and so was V.S. Pritchett, and so was Connolly. I think a much healthier attitude is Chesterton's, who regard it as a privilege to be a journalist and to be given this sort of bit in the centre, in his case, the centre page of the Daily News, to tell people what he thought, tell hundreds of thousands of people what he thought. I think I do regard that as a sort of privilege, and also good fun.
You're very unusual, I mean, especially, I suppose, among Scottish writers. I mean, Scottish novelists or creative writers, in that you do engage in the politics of the day. I mean, you have written books that are way off the beam of most modern Scottish writers. I mean, you've written one called How Should Health Services Be Financed? And the novelist's view of the market economy. I mean, I can't think of many writers who would delve into waters as deep as that.
Well, the books, as a slight exaggeration, were pamphlets, and both of them came about essentially because I was asked to do them. Both were, in fact, suggested by Alan Peacock as the director of the David Hume Institute, and they were holding a conference on the financing of health services, and he asked me if I would act as sort of rapporteur and write up a piece about it. So that's a piece of journalism, really. And the novelist's view of the market economy is, I suppose, it was a lecture, it's an essay, and it's actually a very interesting subject, because novelists, by their nature, belong to the free market, and yet they tend to be rather hostile to it, or to its manifestations, to its workings, and I think that is quite an interesting subject. I mean, if you take somebody like Dickens, who I quoted extensively in that lecture, I mean, Hard Times is a fierce indictment of the workings of the capitalist system, the Industrial Revolution. And yet Dickens, of course, was not only a novelist, but a successful entrepreneur as a magazine and newspaper proprietor.
And he couldn't actually see where they merged, or choose not to see where they merged.
He lived them both in parallel, really.
But how does journalism then interfere with your writing life, your creative fiction life? People say that they can't disengage. They've got to have a long stretch at writing a novel, and they have to become immersed in it. How do you block off your time? What's your working day like?
Well, I'm not very efficient at that sort of thing. I worked at what is to hand, as it were. I've got certain fixed points in the week for journalism, certain commitments which have to be done, a couple of columns, a couple of reviews. Otherwise, there's a certain amount of ad hoc. I mean, somebody rings up and says, "Are you available today?" And you think of the price and say, "Yes." When I'm working a novel, I try to do less journalism, but I'm not very good at turning it away. Like all freelancers, you think if you say no too often, they stop coming and asking you. But journalism, after all, again, by its nature, has to be done in the first part of the day. I would tend to work in sort of 2 blocks in a day. I don't start as early as I used to, but I'm certainly not one of those people who gets up at 6 o'clock and does it 2,000 words.
You don't do a Scot and have your work finished by breakfast,
no, it'd be very nice if I did. Trollope the same, but no, I can't manage that. I potter about in the morning and take the dogs out and perhaps put the horses out in the field and have cups of coffee and read yesterday's newspapers, and eventually get up to my study at about 10:30 usually.
Has your routine changed from your early days as a writer? I mean, have you become fixed in your routines, or do you find that you can pretty much work anywhere? Do you need a view? What's the view outside your study window, for example?
Well, it's generally clogged up by cigarette smoke, but when it isn't, when the window's wide enough open to let which, Scotland's about 3 months in the year perhaps, to let the cigarette smoke out, it's a nice view. It looks over onto trees and a pond which is rather overgrown, and then fields on the other side with cattle and sheep in them, and then up to woods. So it's a good view.
And what do you write on? What's your instruments?
I write on the typewriter most of the time. I would like to say it's an old manual, but it isn't actually. It's a sort of lightweight electronic one which has to be frequently replaced. And so I use that and write on paper.
Mm. And do you write differently, say, the novels to the journalism? Is there a different routine for them, or can you sort of move from left hand to right without any worries at all? I mean, do you write all this in the same room?
I write always in the same room, unless occasionally I'm away from home. When then, I mean, I do something to journalism away from home. I've never written any novel away from or fiction away from home. The only sort of variation to it really is that on the 2 or 3 occasions when I've been writing a play, I tend to write the first draft of that in longhand. I don't know quite why that is, because I use a lot of dialogue in most of the novels, and that comes quite happily on the typewriter. But the play, somehow or other, it seems easier to do it in longhand first.
And do the novels require much research? I mean, the journalism, there you are sitting in ivory towered in the Borders and asked to comment on the great affairs surrounding you of the day. And yet the novels, recent times, for example, have plunged back into the classical era. Do they require you to do much research?
I'm never very happy with the word research in connection with fiction, in that it suggests always that you have got up the subject in order to write the novel. And I doubt if you write very good novels if that is your way of going about it. I think that to write a novel you should have lived with the subject for a long time. You should know it well before you start thinking of writing the novel. I use, in the ancient Roman ones, I do use published material, obviously, but mostly to check. And and sometimes when inspiration flags, it's quite useful to say, okay, what did Plutarch say about this campaign? What was his account of it? Read that over and, like Shakespeare, crib a bit.
If you write, I suppose, historical fiction,
yes,
as you've done with the Roman books and with your book set in the Second World War, and indeed around the Aldo Moro case, the death of men, people then begin to think, well, where does fact end and fiction begin? What do we take on trust and what do we not take on trust?
That's an interesting question, a very difficult one. I'm not at all sure that the distinction between fact and fiction is a true one. I would rather talk about truth. And then fiction whether it is based on something, say like the moral case or something, will actually very often be truer than what passes
than
as
a journalistic report or
yes,
something like
yes.
that, yeah?
Because there has been an attempt, if it is well done, there has been an attempt to imagine the reality rather than merely report a version of it. I mean, there is never one truth about any human relations, any relationship between two people. If you think of a marriage, there is no one truth about the marriage. There's no one truth about a friendship. There's no one truth about any incident.
When you set out, do you plan it? I mean, do you have charts, and do you have a direction, and do you have genealogies, and do you have lists of your characters with traits and things that distinguishes them?
I have a direction. I know roughly where the book's going. I have sometimes genealogies, but that's more to keep myself straight, and dates of birth and so on. I don't have charts, and I generally don't know what's going to happen in detail. I may know that there's got to be a big scene here or a big scene there. Obviously, it varies depending on the type of book. If you're the ancient Roman ones, the outline course of them is set.
Yeah.
Because you can write historical fiction in which you play about with chronology and facts, and you can write historical fiction in which the wrong thing happens. You can say this is what should have happened. Well, I haven't done any of that.
You've discovered lost manuscripts.
Yes. Well, that's an old Scottish game, isn't it? That in a sense, I did it with the first two Roman ones, and it started accidentally, that the Augustus was written in two books with an interval in between, and my publisher thought it would be helpful to put in a linking passage written, as it were, by an editor to say what had happened in between. And then I thought it'd be fun to do this sort of imaginary manuscript. I got rather tired of it after two of them.
It's interesting you say that you changed what you were doing on the suggestion of an editor. Many writers nowadays wouldn't pay any heed at all to an editor, from what one can gather.
Well, he was a good editor.
And you find that you get good editing now?
I've been lucky, actually. I don't get a lot of editing, but the people I've been dealing with, the suggestion they made have been sensible and helpful. But there's not a lot of it.
Do you get a feeling, though, as you write more books, of your own inability to do things as a writer? People say that, well, writers surely get better as they grow older, but it seems to me that writers must become more aware of what they can't do as a writer.
Yeah, I think Graham Greene put it very well. You find you have become a prisoner of your method. And I think that's undoubtedly true. You know there are subjects you can't deal with, because you know there are particular ways in which you can deal with your subject. You also realize that there are ways in which you yourself are incapable of dealing with your subject.
Sometimes you're actually very surprised then when you see a writer moving into an area that he's never touched before. Updike's most recent novel, for example, he's writing about the familiar things of middle-class sex, health in America, golf. But then there are huge passages where he sort of describes the natural world. And you think, well, how can he do that? How does he know so much about the changing seasons' effect on the plants in the garden? I mean, that is the kind of thing where you're only aware of it when it's not there in certain writers, you know?
Yes.
You couldn't imagine, for example, Dickens writing about the tundra or the steppe or anything like that, in a natural way.
Of course, if Dickens had gone there, I think he could have.
He could, perhaps. Could he have written about lesbian sex, do you think? Or
he did.
Whereabout?
David Copperfield. Rosa Dartle is undoubtedly lesbian, I think.
Yes, yes.
Yes. I mean, actually, Dickens is a bad example to have because
he could probably have done anything.
When
yes.
I think of it, it's very hard to find what Dickens couldn't do, except, of course, that the complaint made by the well brought up and genteel in his own lifetime and for about 50 years afterwards was that he couldn't draw a gentleman or a lady. And you'll find that being said in Somerset Maugham's best novel, Cakes and Ale. The narrator's aunt, who's the vicar's wife in Blackstable, this Kentish village, says, "I always thought Dickens couldn't draw a gentleman."
What advice would you give to a young writer now setting out then? I mean, what have you experienced that you would not like them to experience? And what have you done that you think could be reproduced and would help them in a career?
Well, of course, the tempting answer is merely to say, do something else. But
well, that's not an option.
But that's not. But it would also be a dishonest answer. I mean, I think that the life of a writer has many disappointments and so on, but then every life has that. And what it does have is, it gives you the illusion, at least, of being your own master. You can decide not to work when you're... As for the advice given to them, don't allow yourself to be discouraged by rejections. That's the first advice, obviously. Try and find... and this is the most important thing, an individual voice. Because if you actually look at the writers who last, what they nearly always have is something very distinctive in their tone of voice. And those writers who don't have that, however good they are somehow become submerged. But how you find that is a very difficult matter. Maybe you don't have it, but you've got to try and have a distinctive voice.
Can you think of contemporaries who you admire, who you think should be better known?
Well, I think that, in Scotland, I think Willie McIlvanney is... I would like to have thought The Kiln, which I think is his best novel, and I think as good a novel as has been written in Scotland in the last 25, 30 years. I would like to think that had sort of brought him back to the level of esteem that he was in, I think, when Doherty came out 20 years ago, but I'm not sure that it has. I think the sort of, the young blood is rather sort of washed over him.
Would you rather be starting out now as a novelist in Scotland at a time when it does seem that so much attention is focused on here and that people are wondering what will these young Turks do next? I mean, they're very much the writers of the moment. I mean, is this not the time for example, the Alan Massey great novel on Whither Scotland, the great Scottish novel, the novel that's going to say, well, here's the devolved Parliament about to be with us in a couple of years' time, but Massey should look 20 years down the line and give us independence and his view on it.
I don't think you can set out to write the great Scottish novel any more than think of the disasters of the great American novel.
You could have a stab at it.
Yes, but again, looking 20 years ahead, no. If the great Scottish novel is to be written in the next 20 years, it will turn out to be something like what The Last Tycoon might have been if Fitzgerald had lived to finish it.
But the fragment we have is pretty good, I think.
The fragment we have is terrific. But there's a fragment.
Maybe you'll leave us with a fragment.
Perhaps the great American novel was always a fragment.
A fragment of the imagination.
Yes.
At what point do you realise that a novel is finished?
There usually comes a point about 2/3 of the way through when I have the last scene in my mind. And I know where the destination is. I can see, as it were, the square where I'm going to park my car. And when I've reached that, and I don't drive, but nevertheless, to maintain the metaphor, when I've reached the square and got it in the parking place, I switch the engine off and take the keys out and leave.
And what do you do then? Do you reward yourself with a great whoop of joy? Do you get plunged back into journalism, or do you go and watch a game of rugby?
Well, if it's Saturday, probably that, but except I don't work on Saturdays.
Never?
Well, try not to work on Saturdays. I very rarely work on Saturdays. I'm afraid I work on Sundays.
And do you reward yourself, though, at all?
I usually just say, thank God that's over. And then I take it to be photocopied and put it in the post with a note saying, sorry, it's late.
Always sorry it's late?
Nearly always, yes.
Is your agent the first person to read you, then, or is his opinion the opinion you value most?
Quite often, not invariably. But I don't usually send him work in progress. I don't now send anyone work in progress. I mean, nobody sees the things I finished, and I don't talk about it, which is superstition. The notion that you can talk a book away.
Or talk the best books out in the pub.
Yeah.
There's more good books written in Dublin pubs than have ever been published in the history of the universe.
I usually say almost nothing about a book until I've finished it.
But most of your books are dedicated to your wife, Alison, aren't they?
Yeah.
Now, at what point does she read them?
When they're published.
And why do you dedicate them to her? Is it because she suffered more than you have?
Probably. Because apart from the fact that she's my wife, she has provided the stability in my life which has made it possible for me to do it. I think without her I would have written very few novels and would probably be dead anyway.